So with that, I'm just going to review sort of what Jake, Mr. Sumner, is going to go over. As we do these monthly sessions, this is our January monthly Can We Talk? We talked about issues on the spectrum of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. Today, we are essentially talking about whiteness and centering that in independent schools, how we center that in white privilege. Jake, Mr. Sumner, has worked in independent day and boarding schools for 13 years as a teacher, coach, advisor, and administrator. He has an active presence in diversity, equity, inclusion work at Worcester Academy and with outside organizations. He's a frequent speaker at the Association of Boarding Schools, and most recently has been on faculty of Young Men of Color Schools. Worcester Academy has led several professional development sessions for faculty around race and racial identity, namely the past faculty series. Mr. Sumner shared his short bio with me for today. He's all too modest. Mr. Sumner is a staple in the student experience in centering E&I at Worcester Academy. We're very grateful for that. There aren't that many practitioners that are outside of the realm of the E&I office that are championing the work. And it is not pointedly their job to do in leadership, but centering it in everything that they do. The way that we elevate equity, inclusion, and justice is that we thread it through the fabric of the organization that with the work that we do. So we are intentional about every decision we make, and every program we run, and every student we serve. And Mr. Sumner does that. So I'm grateful for that. I know our community is grateful for that. And today, he's going to talk about how it's counterproductive to only think of white privilege in terms of economics. Many white people get stuck because they don't believe themselves to have a privileged upbringing due to real economic difficulties in their lives. White privilege also has many less tangible and explicit benefits, such as the freedom from worry that one will be persecuted due to one's race. Scientific research has discovered many associations between chronic racial stress or racial fatigue and various health problems. So we asked the question, Mr. Sumner asked the question, what role does race play in your life, in your education, and what does it mean to be white? And with that, I'm going to turn it to Mr. Sumner.
Thank you very much. Our topic today is going to be focusing on defining and decentering whiteness in independent schools. You're going to see a lot of information up here that's going to be either visiting or revisiting, especially our definitions that we're going to start with. We're speaking to an audience that might know these definitions really, really well, and speaking to an audience who maybe has their first time seeing them. And so if you've seen stuff that you've seen before, that's totally fine. We're going to try and get a little bit of a deeper dive as we go further along in the presentation. If you want to, also, we're going to have a few very quick times to talk to the people next to us in kind of breakout sessions. Feel free also, we have the presentation in the back printed up so you can kind of follow along. There's going to be a lot of data up on the screen that we're not going to be able to dive into, so I would suggest grabbing that as well. A few graphs and things like that. And also in the back, there's a lot of great resources and books to take a look at if you'd be interested in learning a little bit more afterwards. So with the only having 40 or so minutes, as we go through these different sections today, ideally they would be a session on their own. And we do anywhere between 3 or 5 sessions on each of them. And we usually have time to kind of build our norms in a way. But here are our norms for today. Making sure we're going to practice some empathy as we especially learn about where each other are in this work. Focusing on your own learning first as we get to the actual action steps of what does it mean to decenter whiteness in an independent school setting. It really begins with you. And so we're going to ask for a lot of introspection as we go into this today. And so making sure you're focusing on what that learning looks like for you. And of course, as always, this is probably one of the most important ones. The goal is not to agree. I would say that again, the goal is not to agree, it's to gain a deeper understanding and making sure we're always speaking from the I perspective and of course, open to new ideas. So make sure we bring these with us as we go into our conversation today. Our agenda as we look at our 3 different sections, and again, we might go through some of them pretty quickly, and that's not because they're not important in any capacity, it's simply because of the time constraint, all right? We would ideally focus these in 1 or 2 hour sessions kind of on their own. Some of them could be almost entire classes, right, in our curriculum, focusing on white privilege and white fragility. So the immediacy, or I say how fast we go through them, again, is not because they're not important, because we want to make sure we get to all components. So we're going to first focus on these definitions, either visiting or revisiting, depending on where you are in this work. What is whiteness as a race? right? White privilege as well. Where does that play in your life? But also in independent schools and specific to Worcester Academy. And then we'll talk about white fragility. Of course, plays into the definitions of white privilege and whiteness as well. Section 2 is going to be a little bit of action steps. Before we can even get to the whole action of decentering whiteness at an independent school, we need to answer a lot of questions on our own. And it's a personal process before it can become an institutional process. And that's going to be a key step for us. And last but not least, kind of getting to back to our title here, is what are the steps we as an institution can take about decentering whiteness at our schools? And this isn't, of course, just going to encompass Worcester Academy, independent schools, public institutions as well, but in a lot of ways focused on here today at Worcester Academy. So our first definitions, and again, if you'd like to, you have some handouts in the back that you can grab. Before we get to our breakout sessions and before you focus on kind of discussing with your partner, I want to make sure we revisit some of these definitions. Number one is whiteness as a race. I want to make sure that as we look at this, with its ties to even things like eugenics and this kind of justification for white nationalism in a lot of capacities, this social construct of race, this social construct, of course, of whiteness, even more importantly, simply put, was created with this purpose of exclusion and dispossession. If you haven't read one book that I would recommend out of all those back there today, is the book Caste. It is a fantastic book that focuses on a true social construct of race, but specifically whiteness in the United States and how it applies to really how society still functions today. Our second definition we want to make sure we focus on is white privilege. This is one of the slides that I would encourage you again to grab the handouts. We're not going to have time to go through all of them. I begin to focus with white privilege on the economic side of things. And I do that because it is, of course, not the only component or even the most important component of white privilege, but it is one especially that white students, white faculty, and schools usually focus on. Right, so it is important to note, it is a significant aspect of white privilege, yes. However, with that, we want to make sure that we're being productive in our conversations, and it's very much counterproductive to only focus on the economic side of white privilege. And we're going to talk about the social aspects of that as well, the educational aspects of white privilege, of course, in decentering whiteness in our schools and what that means. Does economics play a role? Without a doubt. But there's several other components that pair with that. The other thing we were going to focus on a lot, especially in schools, and this comes down to the experience of not just, of course, our white students. We're talking about decentering whiteness today, but the experience of our students of color as well. And making sure that white privilege has these intangible benefits. It's not just the quantifiables of economics, right? Yes, that's a significant component of white privilege. But what we want to focus on today as well is what are those intangibles, right? The experience, the day-to-day experience, microaggressions, we'll talk about those as well. The burden of representation in independent schools for our students of color. We'll talk about that too. Right? So not those same tangible, quantifiable things. And I'm going to read this right off the screen because this is an important kind of summary of white privilege. Refers to the benefits that accrue to those in our society who are deemed white. I would say to those in our schools who are deemed white. These benefits can be concrete and quantifiable, but are also often intangible and subconscious. The deemed white is an important thing here because this social construct of whiteness and of race has evolved for those who are in the majority power, specifically in the time throughout the history of the United States. And that's an important thing to note as well, right? And what whiteness meant in 1800s versus what it means in 2022, right? And those who were majority in power had the ability to shift what that definition meant for those to benefit from it. I'll put this up. You can just take a look real quick. I won't read through each of those, but just some quick definitions, the tangibles, the intangibles of white privilege, and some of them specifically to schools and other like institutions. Again, if you want to have some hard copies, those are in the back as well. There are going to be a few slides, especially about the graphs that we put up, but we won't be able to go into all those numbers, so I would encourage you to grab those in the back. Our next definition, and this is one I think we could, especially in 2022, could do a whole semester on with white fragility. White fragility is a term that is coined by, find her book back there, Robin DiAngelo, and it's used in numerous capacities in DEI work at this point. But in its essence, it's this lower threshold. And in a few minutes, we'll talk about kind of the bump. Right? When we decenter whiteness, what are those things that the school runs up against, specifically with white constituents in that community, when whiteness is decentered, right? It's usually focused on the white fragility, right? This lower threshold or even discussion, not even action, discussion, right? Even bringing it up, not even about decentering whiteness, even just bringing up, right, conversations about race. We're not even getting to the decentering whiteness piece. So white fragility is going to play a really key role, and I would say in progressing or not the steps to decenter whiteness at a school. One of course, an author that has been put into the limelight a whole lot more in his new roles at BU is Ibram Kendi. His books are in the back as well if you want to take a look. He does a wonderful job in Twitter, social media, Instagram, of kind of highlighting these different examples of where we see white fragility, specifically in politics. And this is just a few weeks ago. This is one word I wanted to continue to focus on today in these examples. I'm going to put a few more up on the screen in the next few slides, is the discomfort. Right? This Florida bill would prohibit public schools and private businesses from making white people feel discomfort when they teach students or train employees about discrimination. We can talk about it, but we're not going to shift your comfort zone. The epitome. You want to look for a definition of white fragility. It's right there. Okay. And a few other examples as we go through. And this is a really key quote from him as well. And of course, he's not the only one championing this work, but I love, he gives great examples in his accounts. Frankly, must be said, whites are not putting a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves. And this is where the interpersonal work, the looking inside yourself and where are you doing the work is being really key in this decentering whiteness conversation. We're going to talk about fear-based responses a little bit later on. And this manufactured panic. I love how he said the kind of manufactured panic. Those fear-based responses specifically, I'm very much in this category, specifically white males in independent schools. And the fear-based response of when you decenter whiteness, what that response is, because they are in many capacities, in many schools, I say not all maybe, but in many schools, the most privileged group. And we'll see that manufactured panic, those fear-based responses can be significant. So this is going to be a really important video because as we define whiteness, that is one definition. And what is white supremacy, right? Interconnected, without a doubt, right? But there's a key kind of a correlation and also difference in those definitions. And we're going to watch this very quickly before we break out and have a quick discussion.
What's the difference between whiteness and white supremacy?
So white supremacy is a system that says that white people are the norm, are normative, are worth more, and are valued at the expense of others. And we think about a culture that idea spawns, that is whiteness. And then we think about white people as people who benefit from the system of white supremacy, whether they participate in it actively or not. And part of this work is about helping people understand that allies and accomplices are people who understand the work. They understand that there's an issue. And understanding white privilege says that I participate in a dominant culture and I benefit from a system of white supremacy, whether I've done something supremacist or not. And that is a personal recognition. We want people to take that personal recognition a step further and say what are the systemic things that actually create this privilege in the first place? And we want them to fight at that level. That's what accomplices do. But I wanted to, I tweet a lot this phrase, watch whiteness work.
So if you were to just summarize in a sentence, what is your message to the white community and white people?
White people got to organize themselves, have to join solidarity work with people of color, and have to use personal experiences to think about how systems allow privilege to manifest at the personal level.
What's the difference between whiteness and white supremacy?
So with those definitions, with everything we see, what I'd like you to do is you just turn to the person next to you. Why are you here? And what are we hoping to come away with? We understand what whiteness is, right? We're going through these quick, right? Per time, we're going through this quick. Whiteness, white fragility, and white privileges. We look at those and understanding as we walk away today, we're going to ask you to have takeaways. All right, we're going to make sure that when you walk away from, you have action steps. Those are really key, as we just heard in that last video. So what I want you to focus on, why are we here, and what do we hope to come away? What do we hope to come away with? I'm going to give you about 2 minutes, 1 minute per person, and then we're going to move on from there. Okay, should give you about 20 minutes, but we'll give you about 2. Go for it. Why are we here? What do we hope to come away with?
Did I
About 30 seconds. All right. We're going to bring it back together and kind of we ask these 2 questions because in this next section we're going to ask you to look at these questions and kind of understand them on a bit of a deeper level. And as we begin to get into the steps of how and in what way is whiteness actually centered on campus, and then of course the decentering whiteness piece, these are going to be really key. What do we hope to come away with? And the action steps are really important as we walk away later in about a half an hour or so. So with that, we need to answer these questions. And on the table behind you is a version of, I would say, a very simplistic version of that racial identity timeline. And understanding, before you can be a part of this active presence in decentering whiteness as a school, understanding what role race has played in your life. Some of the things to focus on as you discuss this are these. Your background. How racially diverse was your neighborhood growing up? What message did you get about race from your childhood neighborhood? When is the first time you had, and this specifically to schools, when is the first time that you had a teacher of the same race as you? And how often did it happen? When did you first have a teacher of a different race than you? How often did that happen? We're asking these questions because in a few moments we'll look at representation and the importance of representation on the school campus. I, of course, cannot speak for every white male in independent school, but for someone who grew up in independent schools, I can tell you that every teacher looked like me for the most part. Right? I did not have a teacher of color until I went to college, my junior year of when I went to college. Right? And that is very much a frequent, and we'll have a few graphs, we'll talk about representation, and how that impacts the learning for both students of color and white students. When was the first time you realized that someone's race made a difference in how they were treated? And I would flip the lens on that as well. What was the first time you realized that your race made a difference in the way you were treated, better or not? Another thing I think I can speak, especially from the white male experience, the realization, depending on where you grew up, the realization that maybe you were privileged or treated differently is a realization that can come way later on in life because of very much white institutions, white neighborhoods, right? The full white experience without actually having to understand what that privilege is. And these are questions I'm going to ask for you to discuss with the person you just actually talked with. This is going to be really key. What does it mean to be white? And what does it mean to be white in the independent school and at Worcester Academy? This one might take a little bit more processing than our last questions. But specifically at our school, specifically at an independent school, what does it mean to be white? What does white privilege look like in that space? What is the experience of white faculty, of white students? So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes with the person next to you to discuss those two questions. What does it mean to be white in general in society? Is a very vague, there are a lot of layers to that question. But in a more specific sense, what does it mean to be white in an independent school setting and or at Worcester Academy? Go for it. Give you about 2 minutes. And I'd love to hear if you share out a little bit too. I'd love to hear from anybody who wants to share out.
Yeah, so it feels like a place which is not like it's like when you take a picture of and that's just like how it is. Like the library. Exactly. Yeah. You can still have like people in a classroom, but it's just getting right. Right. Or there's like a picture with like 6 white kids and then they have like
All right, we'll bring it back together. Anybody want to, for especially our second question, what does it mean to be, oh, you didn't? Oh, sorry. Anybody get to the second one? Specific to Worcester Academy? Yes.
For us, for me at least, it was going into a class and kind of seeing somebody that looks like you in every class, and realizing that some of your classes aren't diverse and there isn't that person of color in your class, and like that's kind of the norm, feeling norm, I guess.
Yeah, just we were talking about like how like I could go throughout my day and like not think about race or have that be a large part of my monologue.
Ashley and I talked about the same thing. Actually, like just like seeing representation in general. We're saying even if you look up kids in a classroom and it's just like a bunch of white kids and a white teacher in a room, and it's something that like is maybe not thought about as much, but it is like definitely a fact.
Also, like the microaggression portion of it, like we assume people who are racist, like it's gonna be so like in your face, but most of the time that people are saying stuff, like it's small microaggressions that, like for me personally being white, like I don't notice it, but if someone else brings it to my attention, I'm like, oh my god, I totally missed that, because it's not necessarily affecting me. That probably happens in the classroom much more than we care to admit.
Absolutely. Yeah, sure. We'll talk about the representation piece and how the microaggressions I think are tied into that in many capacities as well. And that's not specifically speaking of Worcester Academy, even pointing certain questions to a student of color about a certain topic because they are that one student of color in the classroom, right? And how that can impact somebody. We've heard of that time and time again. independent schools as well. And the assumption that we're going to put that burden of representation simply because it is a student of color, and how that impacts them in that classroom setting. Any other thoughts? I feel like we could spend an hour on this slide alone. Any other thoughts on those two questions?
I just think it's interesting that setting means so much.
That what?
That setting means so much.
What do you mean by that setting?
Well, it says, what does it mean to be white? How would the answer be so different depending on the setting that you're in? And the next question is about Worcester Academy. So I just find it interesting that setting really matters, I guess, with this question more than I would have realized.
Yep.
Like what does it mean to be white in Massachusetts? What does it mean to be white in, wherever? So I find that kind of interesting how the answers are so different.
And I think what's important about the different settings is, whether it be state, school, businesses, and things like that, is that the white privilege doesn't disappear in those settings, right? It evolves and shows up in different ways, maybe, right? Maybe it's more, it's maybe not those microaggressions that Ashley talked about. It's more of the right to your face racism, right? Maybe it's that. Maybe it's more microaggressions. Maybe it comes in different ways. But I think that's really important to note as well, that simply being in Massachusetts versus, let's say, Mississippi, for example, in the Deep South, or over in California, or in North Dakota, anywhere else in the country, that white privilege is still there, right? As a white male, we're still very much engaging in those behaviors because of our white privilege, right? But yes, in different places, maybe there's more things in place to make you recognize your white privilege, right, than somewhere else. But it's still there. I think that's really important to know. So let's talk about what this whole defining and decentering whiteness is. Before we can do that, we need to look at how are we actually centering whiteness right now in our schools. And we're going to diverge a little bit from talking about independent schools, and I do that because as students come to Worcester Academy, not all of these students have been at an independent school their entire life. Some of them have been in public schools, some have been in charter schools. So we need to look at where our students are coming from as well. And to do that, we need to first understand and remind ourselves that centering whiteness at the core of our curriculums, the core of our athletics, our discipline systems, our hiring practices, the way our board operates, the way everyone from our first year faculty member to the head of school operates, is a form and a action of privilege in so many different capacities. And the continued centering of continues to impact in a negative way, not just students of color, but the learning environment of all of our students and our families and their experience. And here's some examples. This is 3 of maybe several dozen that we can talk about, not just at Worcester Academy, but of course at all independent schools. First and foremost, and this does not speak to all of our schools in any capacity, but it's important to note that many independent schools and the foundation of them, the building blocks of these schools, were made for wealthy white male students and faculty. So at the core of who these schools are, right, policies are not built for equity. And as student populations, as faculty populations, maybe boards have shifted a little bit too. The makeup of different families, all these different constituencies, the founding policies have not evolved as much as the diverse student populations have. And we'll talk about that with discipline practices here in a moment. Makeup of the faculty and staff. How are our students represented in the makeup of our faculty and staff? What hiring practices do we have in place to ensure that a place like Worcester Academy, who I would say compared to other independent schools, has a more diverse student makeup, are our faculty and staff actually represented in different leadership roles on the board as well, right, in all leadership and faculty and staff positions. And then, of course, representation curriculum. The quote up top is really key as well. Of many of these schools, I have a lot of friends, specifically in the Deep South, we talk about in my class right now, we're talking about Jim Crow era, 1920s, really to the 1960s or so. And there's a book in the back called the New Jim Crow as well. And with a lot of these schools, especially in the Deep South, were made specifically when public schools went into integrating the school systems. And that's really key. So you go back to the main point, the schools were made specifically for wealthy white male students. Again, not all, but many of them were. And in many states, it was actually a direct reaction. We're talking about white fragility. It was a direct reaction to the attempt to segregate those schools. Right? So the core, the founding, the building blocks of that institution is inequity. That doesn't mean it can't evolve, it doesn't mean it can't change, but it's important to know. This is for New York City, right? So not totally applicable to Worcester Academy, but this is one of many graphs that shows this one because I think it's the most glaring. It's data that's not present for this year in 2022, but this is the different curriculum that we see in schools. And again, we're diverging from just independent schools, but to understand curriculum that our students truly come from all over the world, right? And all over the country. And understanding where our students are coming from. And this data, you can easily look up for the data in Massachusetts as well. The curriculum is very similar to what we see. And this is one of the most, if not the most diverse student population in a public school system in the US, in New York City. And this is their scholastic book list. Right. In the most diverse student population, one of the most diverse student populations in a public school you'll see in our country. Right. And that's the representation or lack thereof in the curriculum. Right. And what's key, what's important about this is that our students come into Worcester Academy. It's not just about how we decenter whiteness in our space, it's understanding the experience that they are coming with. So they've gone through curriculums coming to Worcester Academy focused on whiteness. Right, so then it's also important to understand when they come into a curriculum, right, where we start to evolve our curriculum practices, we have more voices of color, then what is that response going to be from student and from family? Right, and understanding what that difference in approach is. And this, of course, is the breakdown of New York City students. Very diverse, you can see. The last piece I want to focus on, and we'll move on, is this is for Teachers College. However, I don't want to focus just on Teachers College because this is what you'll see in most educational curriculum across, whether it be master's programs or undergraduate as well. So when we look at hiring practices, and we think of faculty representation, and the way our teachers are getting trained as well, and how they're coming into this space, the way they've been trained, the curriculum they had is also way underrepresented, right? That's one example, right? And I'm not going to focus on Teachers College because it's an amazing, right? But it's not the only one. If you look at any educational curriculum, it's focused on that same demographic, white authors, especially when it applies to educating for administrators, faculty, and staff in independent school settings. This data is way old, but it's important, an important map. I wasn't able to find the most updated ones. You can't see it too well, so again, grab the handouts in the back. So you have this curriculum, way overrepresentation, right, with white authors, overrepresentation of white students in private schools. And again, this is obviously decentering whiteness is focused on also making sure that faculty and staff, but also the student diverse population as well. I'm not going to focus on this too much to go through all the numbers. It explains a little bit more in the handouts in the back. And this is really important too. This is public school data, yes, but again, we have students who come at Worcester Academy from 9th grade through postgraduate, actually 6th grade through postgraduate that have been in public school settings. So when they come into our systems, and our systems are discipline systems, and many other things can get better. The discipline systems that we're seeing across the country are disproportionately for the same exact behaviors. We're seeing different disciplinary responses for those students of color. And this is just one of many different graphs that we have shown. This is specifically Black girls, Black boys, right? But the same thing with Latinx students as well. So they're bringing that experience with them to independent schools, of course. And those white students are where the accountability is different for them. Right? Talk about white privilege. The accountability is different for them for the same behaviors. And they're bringing that to these spaces as well. Oh, yeah. Gotta move. Okay. So what does it mean to decenter whiteness? And these, of course, are not all the action steps. The key thing with decentering whiteness is that making sure that in everything we do, and this has to be our action steps when we walk away today, is whiteness is not the default. Right? Whiteness is not the first lens we use in planning, whether it be programming, orientation, rooming assignments, and everything. Decentering whiteness does not mean the same thing as disserving white students. That is crucial to understand. Making them part of the whole rather than not the center. And when doing everything, we need to make sure we ask this initial question. In what ways are marginalized voice represented in all of our planning? This graph, we're not going to, again, go through, but you'll see in the back on our handouts, kind of steps that you can take on a personal level to decenter whiteness on a daily basis as well. Again, it begins very much with that personal experience and personal action steps to actually do this. And then the irony in this as well, and this is from D'Angelo in one of her books, is that as we work to decenter whiteness, what we also must prepare for is how do we scaffold what the white privilege looks like in the space, but also the white fragility. What are the bumps, what are the roadblocks we as a school, administrators, student, faculty, staff are going to run up against to make sure when we do have those bumps, then we know how to work around them and over them, because they will come up. But I also find it ironic that as we decenter whiteness, we have to plan to make sure that people with white privilege and fragility, we can work with them, right? It's just, yeah, there's a lot to that. And why it's important to do this? Again, something we could probably spend an entire session on. Number one, first and foremost, it's impeding the learning, specifically of students of color, but of white students as well. Right? I go back to the discipline example. Same behaviors, different accountability. Same exact behavior, different accountability, right? That different experience, you're in that same behaviors and different accountability, continuing to build that level of white privilege. All right. Always centering whiteness also, in very many ways, dehumanizes the experience of those BIPOC students in our school. Sorry. The last thing, and this is important as we begin to decenter whiteness, and I should actually take these steps, and we'll get to the action steps at our last slide here before you go, is, and I can definitely speak to this, the fear-based responses from white folks in the community, especially white males. If you take 17-year-old Jake Sumner, who's gone through independent school his whole life, he's experienced curriculums that are white-centered, or almost completely white. And you begin to, let's say, take the smallest step of introducing authors of color in his English class. The first time he's experienced that in an all-white, pretty much all-white school, there's a fear-based response. And the perception, not the actuality, but the perception of replacing him rather than continuing to make him part of the community. And there's also a fear-based response because the perception is that there is in some way taking away a privilege that he has experienced that he does not know how to function in the world without. And that is horrifying, especially for white males. There is an understanding that when you acknowledge your privilege, and you acknowledge, especially as a white male, what your privilege is and how deep it actually runs in your daily life, you don't want to acknowledge it because when you do, you understand that without that privilege, you cannot function in the same way because you don't know how to. I know that when I walk into the doors of Worcester Academy or any other independent school, any business, any school, right? Because of the way I look, I am treated a certain way. And the fear-based responses come from the acknowledgement that if I know and I acknowledge what my white privilege is, my white male privilege is, and I no longer have that, or if I'm taking steps to decenter my own white privilege, how do I then function without it? Because I don't know how to. And that's where a lot of those fear-based responses come from. Right? So knowing that going into these conversations and being able to navigate the conversations are really important. So defining where your school is. These are the key questions, and these are your action steps. How do white people come together and make, this is probably the most important one for me in independent schools because this happens every single day at any independent school. How can white people come together and maintain white solidarity? Okay, and the definition of solidarity is below. Right? Unity of thought, feeling, action among members, think of like curriculums. Right? Understanding you can be in a class and be all white students with an all white curriculum. Right? How are we maintaining that solidarity day in and day out, but also year after year? Right, so that's action step number one. Understanding that and taking action on that. Number two, exclusionary whiteness. I would say all these are important because all these happen every day. How does exclusionary whiteness manifest itself in the workplace? Right, that's for faculty and staff, but also in the classroom for students. Exclusionary whiteness. An environment in which whiteness becomes a prerequisite. In other words, you have to conform to the whiteness in the school to be successful academically, socially, athletically. Number 3, how do white people respond when the topic of racism comes up? That's what we just talked about, those fear-based responses. Right? If I acknowledge this, I'm acknowledging my white male privilege. Am I going to lose that? Well, if I lose that, how do I even function in this environment, which was, again, built for me? At the founding of these schools was built for wealthy white males. And if I acknowledge my privilege and I begin to understand it, and it becomes decentered in the school, well, then how do I function in this world? Right? That's where those fear-based responses come from. And the most important one, what role do you play in white supremacist systems, in taking an active role in centering and decentering whiteness? I would say making sure you can define what tasks, what actual steps do you take every day that subconsciously, you're not even thinking about, actually centers whiteness. Right? It's something I think a lot about. Right? And even in so many ways, the actions I take every day center whiteness rather than the decenter. And it takes a lot of effort each and every day to remind yourself, no, I need to look at this differently. I need to make sure I'm decentering, not centering. You, of course, must own your part. I think I'm just on time, Mr. Walker. Whew. I'm like, and through, okay. Any questions before we get you all off to class today? Any questions? Okay. In the back, there are a few dozen books, a few resources and articles. There's a copy of the presentation if you want to take that as well. Wish I could spend more time on this. We probably could have talked for 3 or 4 hours, but we went through pretty quick. If you have questions, feel free to stay behind. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.